You're listening to Static Whisper Stories. Tonight, a stranger is apologizing to an entire town, and nobody knows what he did. Then the main story begins directly. There's a particular kind of dread that has no name. Not the fear of something jumping out at you. Not the sharp, clean panic of danger. This is slower. It's the feeling you get when something is already wrong, and everyone around you is smiling like nothing happened. That's what Cedar Falls felt like for 3 weeks in. October, and I was the last one to understand why. I want to be upfront about something before I tell you this story. I'm not someone who believes in the unexplainable. I'm a data analyst. I moved back to Cedar Falls, Ohio, 2 years ago, after my husband, Daniel, died, and I came back because I needed something familiar, something small and manageable, something that didn't remind me of the city we'd built our life in. Cedar Falls is not a remarkable town. Population 4,200. 1 grocery store, 2 diners, a hardware store that's been there since 1974. The kind of place where everyone waves at your car, even if they don't know you. Just because it's polite. The stranger arrived on a Tuesday. I didn't see him myself, not at first. I heard about him the way you hear about everything in a town like Cedar Falls, through Marcy Elton at the post office, who told my neighbor Ruth, who knocked on my door Thursday morning with her coffee still in her hand and her eyes wider than I'd seen them in years. You hear about the man going door to door? She said. I told her I hadn't. She described him. Mid-50s, maybe early 60s. Gray at the temples. A brown canvas jacket that looked like it had seen more weather than he had. Always holding his hat in his hands when the door opened. Not wearing it, holding it. Like he'd been taught that was the respectful thing to do. He wasn't selling anything. He wasn't from a church or a political campaign or any organization anyone could identify. He would knock, wait, and when the door opened, he would look at whoever answered with an expression Ruth described as, and this is her word, guilty. He had knocked on her door the previous afternoon. She said he looked at her for a long moment, like he was searching for something in her face, and then he said quietly, almost too quietly, I'm sorry, Ruth. I'm truly sorry for what happened to you. I don't expect you to understand why, and I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to hear it. Then he put his hat back on and walked to the next house. Ruth said she stood in her doorway for 5 minutes after he left, just staring down the street. She hadn't told him her name. She was certain of that. By the end of that week, I'd heard 7 different accounts. Tom Briggs at the hardware store said the man had apologized to him on Wednesday morning, standing outside before the store opened. Told Tom he was sorry about what his family went through last spring. Tom's father had passed in March after a long illness, something only people in Cedar Falls would know. The stranger left before Tom could ask a single question. Patricia Howell, who teaches 3rd grade at the elementary school, told me the man had knocked during her lunch break and apologized for the years she lost. She'd been through a quiet, painful divorce 3 years ago and never spoke about it publicly. She said she wasn't frightened, exactly. She said she felt seen in a way that made her uncomfortable, like someone had read her diary aloud in a voice too gentle to be angry at. People's reactions were strange that way. Nobody called the police, at least not at first. He wasn't threatening anyone. He wasn't asking for anything. He was just apologizing. And somehow that was more unsettling than any threat could have been. I started keeping a list. Old habit from work. I wrote down every account I heard, who he'd visited, what he'd said, whether the apology referenced something real in their lives. By the time I had 11 entries, the pattern was clear. Every apology was accurate. Not vague, not generic, specific, personal, and always referencing something painful. A loss, a failure, a quiet wound the person had never fully talked about. He knew things. That was the only conclusion that my neighbor's son, a 17-year-old named Caleb, said the man had stopped him on the walking trail behind Cedar Falls Park and apologized for the way things turned out with your father. Caleb's dad had walked out on the family when Caleb was 9. Nobody brought it up. It was just a fact of life in town, the kind of thing everyone knew, but no one said. Caleb told me the man's eyes were very steady. He said he didn't look like a crazy person. He looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was trying to put it down. That detail stayed with me 2.5 weeks in. I had 23 entries. I also had a growing unease that I couldn't fully articulate, even to myself, because I was tracking everyone he'd visited. I was mapping the town, drawing lines between houses, noting the sequence. And when I looked at the map, the sequence was almost spiral. He was moving inward through Cedar Falls, street by street, like he had an order, like he was working through a list of his own. I started to wonder, whose list was it? A former colleague of mine, someone I'd worked with briefly before moving back home, had spent the last decade in data security. I called him, told him what I was tracking. He asked me a few careful questions, and then went quiet for a moment. He said, "You ever heard of behavioral data aggregation?" I had. Of course I had. My entire career was adjacent to it. He explained what I already half knew, but hadn't wanted to apply to my own town. That modern data brokers, the companies that sit invisible behind apps, loyalty programs, online purchases, social media scroll patterns, know things about people that those people have never consciously shared. Not just what you buy, what you think about buying, how long you hesitated, when you searched for something at 2 a.m. that you'd never search for in daylight. That they know about grief. They know about loneliness. They know about failing marriages and estranged children and the specific shape of a person's private suffering, assembled from 10,000 tiny digital signals that seemed harmless individually. Someone with access to the right data set, he said, could walk into any town in America and know exactly who lost what, exactly what wounds were still open. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up the morning he knocked on my door. I knew it was him before I answered. I'd been expecting it, or maybe dreading it. I'd watched his spiral tighten on my mental map for 3 days, knowing my house was inside his radius. I'd thought about what I would say. I'd rehearsed questions. I'd told myself I would be calm and analytical, that I would get answers. I opened the door. He looked older up close than I'd imagined from the descriptions. There were shadows under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept normally in some time. The brown canvas jacket was worn at the elbows. His hat was in his hands, fingers turning it slowly, the way people do when they're nervous but trying not to show it. He looked at me for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression. It wasn't shock, exactly. It was more like resignation, like he'd hoped for something different and had just confirmed that he wasn't going to get it. "You're the last one," he said. His voice was quiet, steady. "You're the only one left." I asked him what he meant. He said, "I'm sorry, Claire. I'm sorry about Daniel. I'm sorry for what was done to him, and I'm sorry I wasn't in time to stop it. I know that doesn't help you. I know it doesn't change anything. My husband's name, not my husband Daniel, who had died of a cardiac event 14 months ago at 41 years old. Healthy, athletic, no family history. An event so unlikely that 2 different cardiologists had used the word inexplicable. I told him to tell me everything. I told him I wasn't going to close the door until he did. He didn't come inside. He stood on my porch and he talked, and I stood in my doorway and I listened. And by the time he finished, I wasn't sure what I believed, but I was sure it was the most terrifying thing anyone had ever said to me. His name was Martin. He had worked for 8 years at a company called ArcLight Analytics, a data services firm that contracted to insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, and financial institutions. Their specific product was predictive risk modeling. They fed massive behavioral datasets into proprietary algorithms and produced scores. Life trajectory scores, he called them. Not just health risk, not just financial risk, holistic behavioral predictions. People most likely to become liabilities, burdens, drains on a system. The company sold these scores. He said, "We didn't think of it as targeting people. We thought of it as identifying patterns. We told ourselves it was just data." But the downstream use of those scores was something the company didn't discuss internally. What Martin had spent 3 years piecing together after he left, after a younger colleague had quietly handed him a folder of documentation and then disappeared from his life entirely, was that the scores were being used by at least 2 pharmaceutical manufacturers to determine where not to efficiently distribute certain medications, which regions, which demographics, which zip codes. Cedar Falls, Ohio, zip code 43,071. Not all at once. Not in any way that would show up on a map as deliberate. Just quiet statistical pressure, distribution inefficiencies. A regional pharmacy chain that had restructured its logistics and left gaps in medication availability. Nothing anyone could point to. Nothing that would survive a court case. But Martin had the internal documentation. He had emails. He had the predictive model itself, which listed Cedar Falls as one of 17 test communities in a 5-year study. Daniel had a heart condition that had never been diagnosed because the medication that would have triggered its detection during a routine physical was no longer consistently stocked within 100 miles of Cedar Falls, a medication that 2 years earlier would have been standard. Martin said, "By the time I had enough to take to anyone who would listen, it had already been 3 years. I started trying to find everyone in the affected communities. I started from the outside and worked in. You were always going to be last. Because your case was, your husband's case was the clearest documentation, the most traceable line. I asked him where the documentation was now. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a USB drive. He held it out to me. "There's a journalist," he said, "at the Cincinnati Enquirer. Her name is on the drive. She's been waiting for this for 8 months." I asked him why he was apologizing to everyone instead of just going straight to the journalist. He was quiet for a moment. "Because they deserve to hear it from a person first," he said. "Not from a newspaper article, not from a data set, from a person who made choices that contributed to what happened to them. I needed them to hear it from a face." I stood on that porch for what felt like a long time after he finished speaking. The October air had gone cold without me noticing. My bare feet on the doorstep, my hands still on the frame. I was aware, distantly, of a neighbor's dog barking 2 streets over and a car passing slowly at the end of Cedar Street. Normal sounds. The town doing what it always did. And underneath all of it, this quiet, terrible sense of the ground shifting, because here is what I kept returning to. Standing there with that USB drive in my hand, the algorithm had not made a mistake. That was the part I couldn't stop turning over. There was no glitch, no error, no rogue code running wild. The system had worked exactly as designed. Someone had designed it to work that way. Someone had sat in a room, probably a very nice room with good lighting and decent coffee, and made a series of decisions that produced a model, and that model had produced a score. And that score had traveled invisibly through a supply chain and a distribution network and a regional pharmacy database and had landed, eventually, in the chest of a 41-year-old man in Cedar Falls, Ohio, who liked hiking and terrible science fiction movies and made coffee too strong every single morning of his life. Not a monster. A process. Decisions dressed up as data. That, I think, is the specific horror I've been trying to describe ever since. Not Martin. Not ArcLight Analytics. Not even the lawsuit or the headlines. The fact that nothing needed to be malicious to be devastating. The fact that a spreadsheet can grieve you without knowing your name. He left before I could say anything else. I watched him walk down my driveway and turn onto Cedar Street and keep walking, and I never saw him again. I gave the USB drive to the journalist. Her name was Angela Reyes. She published a 4-part series 6 weeks later. There were federal inquiries. There was a class action lawsuit. There were words like systemic negligence and predictive discrimination in headlines. I read on my laptop at my kitchen table. Alone in the house Daniel and I had planned to grow old in. I don't know what happened to Martin. I looked the way you look for anyone now. Search engines, public records, LinkedIn, social media. There was nothing. A LinkedIn profile that had been deactivated. A company directory that listed him as a former employee with no forwarding contact. It was as if he'd finished what he came to do and simply closed his accounts. Some nights I sit with that and feel something I can't fully name. Gratitude doesn't fit. Grief is too familiar to be what it is. It's something closer to the feeling you get when you understand. Finally, that something terrible had a cause, that it wasn't random, wasn't fate, wasn't the universe being indifferent, that it was a spreadsheet. It was a predictive model. It was 8 years of someone's career, and a series of downstream decisions made in conference rooms by people who never visited Cedar Falls and never would. One man with a worn jacket and a hat in his hands, working his way through a list dot, making sure everyone knew. I was the last one. I still don't know if that makes me special, or if it just means I was the end of the line. The drive is gone. The story is published. The lawsuits are pending. Martin is nowhere. But sometimes, when I hear a knock at the door, I stand still for just a moment before I answer. Not because I'm afraid of who's there, because I'm afraid of what they're carrying and whether I'm ready to hear it.